The scorching sun beat down mercilessly upon the dusty town of Cedar Ridge, Wyoming Territory, in the late summer of 1887. Hot winds swept through the unpaved streets, carrying tumbleweeds and grit that stung the eyes of anyone foolish enough to venture outdoors without proper protection. The wooden buildings, weathered gray by years of exposure to the harsh elements, stood like tired sentinels along Main Street, their facades bearing the scars of countless sandstorms and brutal winters. In the small boarding house at the edge of town, 20-year-old Margaret Maggie Sullivan stood before a cracked mirror, her trembling hands attempting to pin back her auburn hair. Her reflection showed a young woman with delicate features marred by dark circles under her green eyes, testament to the sleepless nights spent agonizing over what this day would bring. The borrowed wedding dress, once white but now yellowed with age, hung loosely on her slender frame. It had belonged to Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house owner, who had worn it 30 years prior during happier times. "You best hurry, girl," her father's gruff voice called from the hallway. Patrick Sullivan's words carried the weight of desperation and shame that had plagued their family for months. "The ceremony's in an hour, and we can't afford to keep Mr. Hartley waiting." Maggie's stomach churned at the mention of her soon-to-be husband's name. She had met Thomas Hartley only twice, once when her father had negotiated the arrangement to settle his gambling debts, and again yesterday when the stoic rancher had come to town to finalize the details. He was not unkind in appearance, standing tall with broad shoulders shaped by years of hard labor, his weathered face bearing the deep lines of a man who had seen more than his share of hardship. At 35, he was 15 years her senior, with dark hair already showing threads of silver at the temples and eyes the color of winter sky, cold and distant. The story of Thomas Hartley was well known throughout Cedar Ridge. 5 years ago, bandits had attacked his homestead while he was away selling cattle. They had murdered his wife, Sarah, and their 2 young children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4. Since then, he had lived alone on his ranch, 20 miles outside of town, rarely venturing into Cedar Ridge except for supplies. The townspeople whispered that grief had turned his heart to stone, that he sought a new wife not for love, but merely for practical help with the ranch and perhaps, someday, to rebuild the family he had lost. Maggie understood she was not chosen for her beauty or charm. Her father owed substantial sums to the dangerous men who ran the saloons and gambling halls. When they had threatened to take their payment in blood, Patrick Sullivan had desperately offered his daughter instead, knowing that Thomas Hartley had quietly inquired about finding a wife through the minister. The rancher had agreed to pay off the debts in exchange for a bride, a business transaction dressed in wedding clothes. The young woman's hands shook as she lifted the yellowed veil. The fabric was thin and torn in places, but it would serve its purpose, to hide her burning shame from the prying eyes of the townspeople. She knew what they would whisper behind their fans and handkerchiefs. The Sullivan girl, sold like cattle to pay her father's debts. Poor thing, married to that cold widower who talks more to his horses than to people. What kind of life will she have, isolated on that ranch with a man still mourning his dead family? A gentle knock interrupted her dark thoughts. Mrs. Henderson entered, her kind face creased with concern. The elderly woman had been like a mother to Maggie since her own had died of fever 3 years prior. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Henderson said softly, adjusting the veil with practiced hands. "You look lovely, despite everything." "I look like what I am," Maggie replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "A daughter being traded to settle a debt, a replacement for ghosts I can never match." Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears, but she maintained her composure. "Now, you listen to me. Margaret Sullivan. Thomas Hartley is a good man, despite his sorrows. He's fair and honest, works hard, and never raises his hand in anger. There are worse fates for a young woman in these parts." Maggie nodded, knowing the older woman spoke truth. She had heard terrible stories of other girls forced into far more brutal circumstances. At least Thomas Hartley was known for his quiet dignity and self-sufficiency. He didn't frequent the saloons or brothels like many men, and his ranch was said to be well maintained despite his solitary existence. The walk to the small wooden church felt like a march to the gallows. Maggie kept the veil pulled low over her face, but she could still sense the stares of the townspeople who had gathered to witness this unusual union. Their whispers followed her like buzzing flies. Shameful business, if you ask me. That poor Hartley, taking on Sullivan's troubles along with his daughter. She's pretty enough, but beauty won't ease the pain of what he's lost. Wonder how long before she runs off. That ranch is no place for a town-bred girl. The church was sparse and austere, with rough-hewn benches and a simple wooden cross adorning the wall behind the pulpit. Reverend Morrison, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, stood at the altar with his worn Bible. Beside him waited Thomas Hartley, dressed in what appeared to be his best clothes, a clean white shirt, dark trousers, and a black coat that had seen better days. His face was freshly shaven, revealing a strong jaw and the premature aging that tragedy brings. As Maggie approached, guided by her father's unsteady hand, she kept her eyes downcast, grateful for the veil's protection. She could feel Thomas Hartley's gaze upon her, but couldn't bring herself to meet it. Her father placed her hand in the rancher's calloused palm and stepped back quickly, as if afraid the deal might somehow fall through if he lingered. Thomas's hand was warm and steady, neither grasping too tightly nor holding too loosely. She risked a glance at his face and found him looking not at her but at the cross on the wall, his expression unreadable. Was he thinking of his first wedding? Of the woman who had stood where Maggie now stood, radiant with a love instead of shrouded in shame? Reverend Morrison began the ceremony, his voice echoing in the nearly empty church. Only a handful of witnesses had come. Mrs. Henderson, the town banker who had arranged the debt payment, a few curious townspeople, and her father, who stood in the back as if ready to flee at any moment. The Reverend's words about love, honor, and cherishing seemed to mock the very nature of this union. "Do you, Thomas James Hartley, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the Reverend asked. "I do," Thomas answered, his deep voice steady but devoid of emotion. "And do you, Margaret Ann Sullivan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Maggie's throat constricted. Through the veil, she could see the morning light streaming through the church's small windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. She thought of her mother, who had dreamed of seeing her daughter married for love. She thought of the life she might have had if her father hadn't gambled away their modest savings and then some. "I do," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Then, by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife." Reverend Morrison declared with obvious relief that the awkward ceremony was concluding. "You may, kiss the bride." This was the moment Maggie had dreaded most. She stood frozen, her face still hidden beneath the veil, waiting for Thomas to make the first move. But instead of immediately lifting the veil, as was customary, he paused. She could sense his hesitation, matching her own. Finally, he spoke, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "We don't need to do this for them. Ma'am, the papers are signed. That's enough for now." Relief flooded through her, and she managed a small nod. Thomas turned to face the small congregation, offering his arm. She took it, and together they walked down the aisle as husband and wife, past the staring faces and out into the harsh sunlight of their new life together. Outside the church, a weathered wagon waited, loaded with supplies. Thomas helped her up onto the seat with surprising gentleness, then climbed up beside her. As he took the reins, Maggie caught sight of her father standing in the church doorway. Their eyes met for a brief moment before he turned away, unable to face what he had done. "Your things?" Thomas asked, speaking to her directly for nearly the first time. "Mrs. Henderson will send them along," Maggie replied, her voice muffled by the veil she still refused to remove. She had few possessions anyway, some clothes, her mother's Bible, a small sewing kit. He nodded and clicked his tongue at the horses. As the wagon rolled away from Cedar Ridge, away from everything Maggie had ever known, she kept her face covered, unwilling to look at the future that stretched before her like the endless, dusty road to Thomas Hartley's ranch, behind them. The church bell tolled once, a lonely sound that seemed to seal her fate with its bronze finality. The wagon wheels creaked rhythmically as they rolled away from Cedar Ridge, kicking up small clouds of dust that hung in the still air like ghosts of the life Maggie was leaving behind. The vast expanse of Wyoming territory stretched before them, endless grasslands burnt golden by the summer sun, punctuated by towering red rock formations that rose from the earth like ancient sentinels. In the distance, the Rocky Mountains painted a jagged line against the horizon, their peaks still capped with snow despite the heat of late summer. For the first hour, neither spoke. Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the rutted trail ahead, occasionally flicking the reins to keep the horses at a steady pace. Maggie sat rigid beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the yellowed veil still obscuring her features. The only sounds were the clip-clop of hooves, the groaning wagon, and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. The landscape they traversed was both beautiful and merciless. Sagebrush dotted the plains, its pungent aroma filling the air when the wagon wheels crushed the silver-green plants. Prairie grass, dry and brittle from months without rain, whispered secrets in the wind. Here and there, bleached bones of cattle or buffalo served as stark reminders of how quickly the frontier could claim lives. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became oppressive. Sweat beaded on Maggie's forehead beneath the veil, and she could feel her wedding dress, already uncomfortable, becoming damp with perspiration. She noticed Thomas pull a canteen from beneath the seat and take a long drink before wordlessly offering it to her. "Thank you," she murmured, lifting the veil just enough to drink. The water was warm but refreshing, and she was grateful for his consideration. "We've got about 15 more miles," Thomas said, his first real words to her since leaving the church. "There's a creek about halfway where we'll rest the horses." Maggie nodded, though she wasn't sure he saw the gesture. She wanted to remove the stifling veil, but couldn't bring herself to do it. It felt like her last protection, her final barrier between herself and this new reality. The creek Thomas had mentioned appeared like a miracle in the harsh landscape. Cottonwood trees clustered along its banks, their leaves rustling with a sound like gentle rain. He guided the wagon into the shade and climbed down, moving to tend the horses with practiced efficiency. "You can stretch your legs if you'd like, ma'am," he said without looking at her. "We'll be here about 20 minutes. Maggie climbed down carefully, her legs stiff from sitting. She walked to the creek's edge, where clear water burbled over smooth stones. Kneeling, she cupped some water in her hands and splashed it on her wrists, feeling the coolness seep into her overheated skin. Through the veil, she watched Thomas water the horses, noting how he spoke to them in low, gentle tones, more words than he'd spoken to her all day. "Their names are Buck and Bella," he said suddenly, apparently aware of her observation. "Had them since they were foals. They're good horses, reliable. They're beautiful," Maggie replied, meaning it. The horses were well cared for, their coats glossy despite the dust of travel. A silence fell between them again, but it felt slightly less oppressive than before. Maggie found a flat rock to sit on while Thomas checked the wagon's wheels and axles. She noticed how methodical he was, how carefully he inspected everything. A man who took nothing for granted, she thought. A man who had learned through loss that life could change in an instant. When they resumed their journey, the afternoon sun beat down relentlessly. The landscape began to change subtly. More hills, deeper valleys, and in the distance, the dark line of pine forests climbing the mountain slopes. Thomas pointed to a distant cluster of buildings barely visible through the heat shimmer. "That's the Anderson place," he said. "Nearest neighbors, about 8 miles from our ranch. Good people. Mrs. Anderson will likely come calling once she hears—" He trailed off, seemingly unsure how to finish the sentence. "Once she hears you've taken a new wife," Maggie finished for him, surprised by her own boldness. "Yes," he said simply. After a pause, he added, "She was friends with Sarah, my first wife. She means well, but she can be persistent." It was the first time he'd mentioned his deceased wife by name, and Maggie heard the carefully controlled pain in his voice. She wondered if she would forever be compared to this Sarah, forever found wanting. As they crested a low hill, Thomas pointed ahead. "There," he said. "That's home." Maggie's first glimpse of her new home was both better and worse than she'd imagined. The ranch house was larger than expected, a solid log structure with a stone chimney and a covered porch running along the front. But it had an air of neglect about it, as if its owner had maintained only what was necessary for survival. No flowers grew in the yard, no curtains softened the windows, no woman's touch was evident anywhere. The outbuildings were in better condition: a large barn, several corrals, a smokehouse, and what appeared to be a bunkhouse, though Maggie doubted any hands were currently employed. Everything spoke of functional efficiency without a trace of comfort or beauty. As they pulled up to the house, a dog emerged from the barn, a large yellow mongrel who barked once before recognizing Thomas and wagging its tail enthusiastically. "That's Scout," Thomas said, climbing down from the wagon. "He's getting old, but he's still a good watchdog." He came around to help Maggie down, his hands careful and impersonal at her waist. She patted Scout's head when he came to investigate, earning a gentle tail wag. "I'll show you the house," Thomas said, grabbing a crate of supplies from the wagon. "Then I need to tend to some chores before dark." The inside of the house reflected the outside, functional but austere. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large fireplace, a sturdy table and chairs, and basic cooking equipment. Everything was clean but sparse. No pictures adorned the walls. No rugs softened the floors. No personal touches suggested this was anyone's home rather than merely shelter. Thomas set the crate on the table and gestured toward a hallway. "There are 2 bedrooms. You can have the larger one. I'll take the smaller." Maggie felt both relief and an odd disappointment at this arrangement. She followed him down the hall, where he opened a door to reveal a bedroom that must have once belonged to him and Sarah. The bed was made with a simple quilt. A wardrobe stood against one wall, and a small window looked out toward the mountains. Like everything else, it was clean but devoid of personality. "I cleared out the personal things," Thomas said awkwardly. "You can arrange it however you like. There's a trunk at the foot of the bed with extra linens." "Thank you," Maggie whispered, still speaking through the veil. He shifted uncomfortably. "I'll bring in the rest of the supplies and then see to the evening chores. There's bread in the kitchen and some cold meat if you're hungry. We usually eat a proper meal at sundown." With that, he left her alone in what was now her room. Maggie stood in the center of the space, finally lifting the veil from her face. The air felt cool against her damp skin. She moved to the window, looking out at the vast landscape that was now her world, beautiful in its wildness, terrifying in its isolation. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Maggie heard Thomas working outside, the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood, the clank of water buckets, the occasional command to Scout. These sounds would become the rhythm of her new life. She realized, this silent man, this empty house, this unforgiving land. She unpinned her hair, letting it fall around her shoulders, and changed out of the wedding dress into one of her simple everyday dresses that Thomas had brought in with her small trunk of belongings. As she folded the yellowed gown, she wondered if she would ever wear it again, or if it would remain like everything else in this house, a relic of a ceremony without joy, a union without love. The first night at the ranch was approaching, and with it, all the uncertainties of her new existence. Through the window, she watched Thomas cross the yard, his tall frame silhouetted against the dying light. He moved with purpose, but also with a solitude that seemed embedded in his very bones. She wondered if 2 broken people could ever make each other whole, or if they would simply exist side by side, like the sparse furniture in this house, functional but forever separate. As darkness crept across the prairie, bringing with it the sounds of coyotes in the distance and winds sighing through the grass, Maggie Sullivan Hartley faced the reality that this was now her life, for better or worse. Until death do them part. Dawn broke harsh and unforgiving over the Hartley ranch, painting the eastern sky in shades of amber and rose. Maggie woke to unfamiliar sounds, a rooster crowing, cattle lowing in the distance, and the clatter of activity from somewhere outside. For a moment, she forgot where she was, reaching for the familiar comfort of her small room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. Then reality crashed back, and she remembered. She was a married woman now, wife to a stranger, mistress of this lonely homestead. She dressed quickly in a simple calico work dress and pulled her hair back into a practical bun. In the kitchen, she found evidence that Thomas had already been up for hours. The coffee pot was warm on the stove, and a plate with biscuits sat covered on the table. Through the window, she could see him in the corral, working with a young horse, determined to prove her worth. Maggie set about exploring her new domain. The kitchen was well stocked but organized with a bachelor's logic. She reorganized the shelves, taking mental inventory of supplies. There was plenty of flour, salt pork, beans, and preserved goods, but no garden vegetables, no eggs, save what might be gathered from the few chickens she'd spotted scratching in the yard. By the time Thomas came in for breakfast, she had prepared a proper meal: bacon, flapjacks, and fresh coffee. He stopped in the doorway, clearly surprised to find her up and working. "You didn't need to," he began, then seemed to think better of it. "Thank you, ma'am." They ate in silence, but Maggie noticed him glance at her several times, as if trying to puzzle something out. Finally, he spoke. "There's a lot to learn about running a ranch. I don't expect you to know everything right away." "I'm a quick learner. Mr. Hartley," Maggie replied, meeting his eyes for perhaps the first time. In the morning light, she could see they were more gray than blue, like storm clouds gathering. "Thomas," he corrected. "You should call me Thomas, and I'll call you Maggie, if that's acceptable." She nodded, feeling an odd flutter at this small intimacy. "What would you have me do today?" He considered this. "Can you handle chickens? Gather eggs? The coop needs cleaning too." "I can do that. There's a vegetable plot out back." He continued. "Sarah used to—" He stopped abruptly, his jaw tightening. "It's gone to seed, but with work, it could be productive again." The mention of his late wife hung in the air between them like smoke. Maggie sensed this was dangerous territory, but felt compelled to acknowledge it. "I'd be glad to tend it," she said softly, "though I might need guidance on what grows well here." Thomas nodded, seeming grateful she hadn't pressed further. "After the morning chores, I'll be riding out to check the cattle in the north pasture. Storm's coming, probably tonight or tomorrow. Need to move them to shelter." As if to confirm his prediction, Maggie noticed the western horizon had a peculiar yellow-gray cast, and the air felt heavy despite the early hour. The morning passed in a blur of unfamiliar tasks. The chicken coop was worse than expected, clearly neglected for months. Maggie tied a kerchief over her nose and set to work, scattering the indignant hens as she cleaned. She found 8 eggs, a reasonable haul, and made a mental note to check for hidden nests. The vegetable garden broke her heart. She could see what it had been: neat rows marked with stones, a fence to keep out rabbits, even the remains of what might have been flower borders. Now it was a tangle of weeds and volunteer plants, though she spotted some hardy potatoes and onions that had survived the neglect. As she worked, pulling weeds and trying to salvage what she could, she became aware she was being watched. Scout had settled nearby, but it wasn't the dog's attention she felt. Looking up, she saw Thomas had paused in saddling his horse to observe her. When their eyes met, he quickly turned away, but not before she caught something in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe a flicker of approval. The wind picked up around noon, bringing with it the smell of rain and something else, a metallic taste that made the horses restless. Maggie was struggling to haul water from the well when Thomas returned, riding hard. "Storm's moving faster than I thought," he said, dismounting quickly. "Need to secure everything. Can you help?" Together they worked with urgent efficiency. Thomas showed her how to check that the barn doors were properly latched, how to cover the hay to keep it dry, how to ensure the animals had access to shelter. His instructions were clear and patient, and Maggie found herself responding to the crisis with energy she didn't know she possessed. The first fat raindrops began to fall as they finished moving the chickens to their secure coop. Within minutes, the drops became a deluge. They ran for the house, both thoroughly soaked by the time they reached the porch. "You did well," Thomas said, water dripping from his hat. Not many town-bred women would work like that without complaint. Maggie wrung water from her skirts. "I'm not afraid of hard work. Thomas, I may not know ranch life, but I know about making do with what you have." He studied her for a moment, and she wondered what he saw. A drowned rat of a girl, probably, with her hair plastered to her head and her dress muddy from the garden. But something in his expression softened. Inside, they stood dripping in the kitchen, suddenly awkward in the enforced intimacy. The storm had darkened the sky to twilight, though it was barely past midday. Thunder crashed overhead, making Maggie jump. "You should change into dry clothes," Thomas said. "I'll stoke the fire." When she returned, dressed in dry clothing with her hair wrapped in a towel, she found he had built up the fire and set coffee to brew. He had changed as well, and something about seeing him in simple work clothes instead of his wedding outfit made him seem more approachable, more human. They sat at the kitchen table, listening to the storm rage outside. The wind howled like a living thing, driving rain against the windows with such force Maggie worried the glass might break. "Will the animals be all right?" she asked. "They've weathered worse," Thomas assured her. "This is just a summer storm. Wait until you see a winter blizzard." The thought of winter in this isolated place sent a shiver through her. Thomas noticed and misinterpreted it. "You're still cold. Here." He rose and took a blanket from a chest near the fireplace, moving to drape it around her shoulders. As he did, his hands briefly touched her arms, and they both froze. It was the first real physical contact since their awkward wedding ceremony. Maggie looked up at him, seeing confusion and something else, loneliness, perhaps, flicker across his features. Then he stepped back, the moment broken. "Thank you," she whispered. He returned to his seat, cradling his coffee cup. After a long silence, he began to speak, his voice almost lost in the sound of rain. "Sarah loved storms," he said. "Used to say they washed the world clean, gave everything a fresh start." He stared into his cup as if it might hold answers. "She died on a clear day, bright sun, birds singing. Seemed wrong, somehow, like the world should have been storming." Maggie's heart constricted at the raw pain in his voice. "I'm sorry," she said, knowing the words were inadequate. "I can't imagine." "No," he said, not unkindly. "You can't, and I hope you never have to." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw him taking in details. Her green eyes, the freckles across her nose, the determined set of her jaw. "Why did you agree to this? Really?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. She considered lying, spinning some tale about duty or family honor, but something about the storm, the isolation, his unexpected vulnerability, made her speak truth. "What choice did I have?" she asked. "My father's debts would have destroyed us both. Those men he owed, they weren't patient types. And you needed—" She paused, searching for words that wouldn't wound. "You needed help here. It seemed a fair exchange." "Fair," he repeated, with a bitter smile. "Is that what we're calling it?" "What would you call it?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Survival," he finally said. "We're both just trying to survive." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the kitchen, a different kind of atmosphere was building. Not warmth, exactly, but something less cold than before. They talked, haltingly at first, about practical things, the ranch's needs, the coming harvest, plans for winter supplies. But gradually, the conversation became less guarded. Thomas told her about the ranch's early days, when he'd first claimed the land with nothing but determination and a handful of cattle. Maggie shared memories of her mother, who had taught school before marrying, and who had insisted her daughter learn to read and write properly despite their modest circumstances. As the afternoon wore on and the storm showed no signs of abating, Maggie prepared a simple supper from the supplies at hand. Thomas watched her work, noting her efficiency and lack of complaint about the limited resources. "You're not what I expected," he said suddenly as they ate. "What did you expect?" He shrugged. "Tears, complaints, demands to be taken back to town. Would that have changed anything?" "No," he admitted. "But it would have made the next 40 years considerably more difficult." It was the first acknowledgement either had made about the permanence of their arrangement, the first suggestion that they were thinking beyond mere survival to an actual future. As night fell and the storm finally began to exhaust itself, they prepared for sleep in their separate rooms. At her door, Maggie turned to bid Thomas good night and found him watching her with an unreadable expression. "You did well today," he said again. "Sarah would have. She would have appreciated how you tended her garden." Before Maggie could respond, he was gone, his door closing with quiet finality. She stood in the hallway, realizing that in his own way, Thomas had paid her the highest compliment he could manage. She was not Sarah, would never be Sarah. But perhaps she could be Maggie, and perhaps, someday, that would be enough. The storm passed in the night, leaving the world washed and gleaming under a canopy of stars. And in the Hartley house, 2 damaged souls slept in separate rooms, each wondering if the other might hold the key to healing wounds they'd thought would never mend. The storm's fury had exceeded even Thomas's experienced predictions. As dawn broke over the ranch, the devastation became painfully clear. The barn roof had partially collapsed under the weight of wind and water. Several fence posts lay scattered like matchsticks, and the chicken coop Maggie had so carefully cleaned the day before was completely destroyed, its inhabitants scattered to the winds. Thomas stood in the yard, surveying the damage with the stoic acceptance of a man accustomed to nature's cruelty. His shoulders, usually straight with quiet strength, sagged slightly under the weight of what needed to be done. "How bad is it?" Maggie asked, joining him. She had risen early, unable to sleep after hearing the crash of the barn roof in the night. "Bad enough," he replied, his voice gravelly with exhaustion. "Lost at least half the chickens. Barn needs immediate repair or we'll lose the hay. And the north fence is down. If the cattle find it before I do, they'll scatter halfway to Colorado." Without hesitation, Maggie began rolling up her sleeves. "Tell me what to do." He looked at her, surprised again by her readiness to help. "Can you handle a hammer?" "I can learn." A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered features. "Then we'd best get started." The morning sun climbed high and merciless. As if making up for yesterday's storm with punishing heat, they worked side by side. Thomas showing Maggie how to hold the board steady while he hammered, how to check if a fence post was truly secure, how to salvage what materials they could from the wreckage. As they struggled to lift a heavy beam back into place on the barn, Maggie's hands slipped on the rain-slicked wood. The beam swung wildly, and she would have been struck if Thomas hadn't pulled her roughly against him, taking the glancing blow on his shoulder instead. For a moment, they stood pressed together, both breathing hard from exertion and fright. Maggie could feel the solid warmth of his chest, smell the mixture of sawdust and sweat that clung to his shirt. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. Not quite desire, but an awareness that hadn't existed before. "You're bleeding," Maggie said, noticing a gash on his shoulder where the beam had caught him. "It's nothing," Thomas said, stepping back, but she could see him wince. "It's not nothing. Come to the house. That needs cleaning." He protested, but Maggie had discovered a core of steel within herself that wouldn't be denied. She marched him to the kitchen and made him sit while she fetched water and the medical supplies she'd located during her exploration of the house. "Take off your shirt," she instructed, then blushed at her own boldness. Thomas hesitated, then complied, revealing a torso marked by years of hard labor and other scars she hadn't expected. A puckered bullet wound near his ribs, what looked like old burns across his back. The bullet was from claim jumpers, early days, he said, noticing her gaze. The burns, the barn fire 5 years ago. He didn't need to say more. She understood. The fire that had taken his family. Maggie worked in silence, cleaning the fresh wound with a gentle efficiency, as she did. She became aware of the intimacy of the moment, the first time she had touched her husband's bare skin, the first time they had been this close without the barrier of propriety between them. "There," she said, tying off the bandage. "Try to keep it clean while we work." He pulled his shirt back on, wincing slightly. "Maggie, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted. "This is my home now, too, isn't it? Those are my chickens scattered across the prairie, my garden that's been washed half away. I may not have chosen this life, Thomas, but I'm here now. Let me help." He studied her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, a recognition, perhaps, that she was not merely a burden he'd taken on to solve another man's problem, but a partner in this harsh existence. They returned to work with renewed purpose. As the day wore on, neighboring ranchers began to arrive. Word of the storm's damage had spread, and the unwritten law of frontier life demanded mutual aid. First came the Andersons, the elderly couple Thomas had mentioned, their wagon loaded with spare lumber and tools. "Heard you got hit hard." "Mister," Anderson said, climbing down with the careful movements of age. His wife, a plump woman with kind eyes, immediately focused on Maggie. "So you're the new Mrs. Hartley," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "I'm Emma Anderson. That's my Eric. We've been meaning to come calling, but thought we'd give you time to settle in." "Please, call me Maggie," she replied, aware of the woman's scrutiny. "I'm grateful for your help." Emma's expression softened slightly. "You look like you've been working hard already." "Good. Ranch life isn't for the faint of heart." Throughout the day, others arrived. The Millers from the south, the Johnsons from across the valley, even old Pete Sanchez who ran cattle on the open range. Each brought what they could spare and willing hands to help. Maggie found herself in the unfamiliar position of being a ranch wife, organizing meals for the workers, keeping water available, tending minor injuries. But she noticed the careful distance some maintained, the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. She was still the Sullivan girl who'd been sold to pay a gambling debt, still the replacement for beloved Sarah Hartley. As afternoon shadows lengthened, most of the critical repairs were complete. The barn roof was patched, if not pretty. The fence posts were reset. A makeshift chicken coop had been constructed. The neighbors began to take their leave, promises to check in over the coming days. Emma Anderson lingered, helping Maggie clean up the remnants of the hasty meals. When they were alone in the kitchen, the older woman's demeanor shifted. "I knew Sarah well," she said quietly. "She was like a daughter to me when she died." Emma paused, controlling her emotion. "Thomas nearly went mad with grief. We thought we'd lose him too." Maggie remained silent, sensing there was more. "I won't pretend I was happy when I heard about this arrangement," Emma continued. "It seemed wrong, somehow too soon, too cold. But watching you today—" She placed a weathered hand over Maggie's. "You're stronger than you look, girl, and Thomas needs strength more than he needs sentiment right now." "I don't expect to replace her," Maggie said softly. "I know I can't." Emma's eyes were shrewd, but not unkind. "No, you can't, but maybe that's not what he needs. Maybe he needs someone who can help him build something new instead of trying to restore what's lost." After the Andersons departed, Maggie and Thomas stood together surveying their domain. The ranch looked battered but not beaten, much like its owners. "Thank you," Thomas said simply. "You worked as hard as any hand today." "Harder. We're partners," Maggie replied, testing the word. "Isn't that what marriage is supposed to be?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, Sarah used to say the same thing, but she meant something different. Love, romance, all those things the poets write about. He looked at Maggie directly. What we have is more like a business arrangement. I suppose, but today it felt like more than that. The sun was setting, painting the storm-washed sky in brilliant oranges and purples. They were both exhausted, covered in dirt and sweat, hands raw from the day's labor. But something had changed between them, a foundation laid not on passion but on mutual respect and shared purpose. That evening, as they sat by the fire nursing their aches and pains, Scout at their feet, Thomas did something unexpected. He pulled out a worn book, Shakespeare's sonnets, and began to read aloud. His voice was unpracticed but pleasant, and Maggie found herself relaxing for the first time since her wedding day. Sarah loved poetry, he said during a pause. I never understood it much myself, but I kept reading after. Seemed like a way to keep her close. It's beautiful, Maggie said. Would you mind if I read some too? He handed her the book, and she chose a different sonnet, one about endurance and strength. As her clear voice filled the room, she saw Thomas lean back in his chair, closing his eyes. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You read well, he said, like a schoolteacher. My mother was one, remember? She made sure I learned properly. Maybe. He hesitated, then continued. Maybe you could teach the local children. Once you're settled, the nearest school is 20 miles away. Sarah always talked about starting something closer. It was the first time he'd suggested she might take on something that had been Sarah's dream, the first indication that he saw a future beyond mere survival. Maggie felt a flutter of something, not quite hope, but close to it, as they prepared to retire to their separate rooms. Thomas paused at her door. In the lamplight, she could see the exhaustion lining his face, but also something else, a lightness that hadn't been there before. Maggie, he said, then seemed to struggle for words. Finally. He reached out and briefly touched the edge of the veil she had hung on a peg by the door, the veil she'd hidden behind on their wedding day. You don't need this anymore. Not here, not with me. After he'd gone, Maggie stood looking at the yellowed veil for a long time. Then, with deliberate movements, she took it down, folded it carefully, and placed it in the bottom of the trunk at the foot of her bed. She didn't need to hide anymore. She had work to do, a ranch to help run, a life to build, outside. Coyotes called to each other across the darkness, and the wind whispered through the repaired barn. It wasn't the life she'd dreamed of as a girl, but it was real and solid in hers. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The thundering of hooves shattered the peaceful morning 3 weeks after the storm. Maggie looked up from the garden where she'd been harvesting the vegetables that had survived, shading her eyes against the sun. A group of riders approached fast, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still air like harbingers of trouble. Thomas emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, his expression grim. He'd been on edge for days, ever since they'd found tracks near the waterhole. Too many horses, moving with the purposeful pattern of men who meant no good. Get inside, he told Maggie quietly, not taking his eyes off the approaching riders. I'm staying, she said, moving to stand beside him. She'd learned to shoot in the past weeks. Thomas had insisted on it, teaching her with patient determination. The weight of the pistol at her hip gave her courage. The riders reined up just outside the yard, 6 men, hard-faced and trail-dusty, led by a man whose cold eyes and scarred face marked him as someone who'd chosen violence as a way of life. Maggie recognized the type from Cedar Ridge, men who haunted the saloons and back alleys, feeding off others' misfortune. Morning, Hartley, the leader said, his voice deceptively pleasant. Name's Jake Coulter. Heard you recently came into some good fortune. State your business and move on, Thomas replied, the rifle held easy but ready in his hands. Coulter's smile was sharp as a blade. Now, that's not very neighborly. We're just passing through, looking for a friend of ours, Pat Sullivan. Heard his daughter married up recently. Thought he might be visiting. Maggie felt ice in her veins. These were the men her father had owed money to, the ones who'd driven him to desperate measures. She forced herself to remain still, knowing any reaction would betray her. No one here by that name. Thomas said flatly, "You've wasted a ride." Have we now? Coulter's gaze shifted to Maggie, taking in her simple dress, her work-roughened hands, the determined set of her jaw. You'd be the new Mrs. Hartley, then. Pleased to make your acquaintance. Ma'am, your father spoke highly of you. My father is no concern of yours, Maggie said, finding her voice. Whatever business you had with him ended when Mr. Hartley paid his debts. Ah, but that's where you're wrong. Coulter dismounted, his movement lazy but threatening. His men remained mounted, hands near their weapons. See, there was interest on those debts. Considerable interest. And since Sullivan seems to have disappeared like smoke, we figured we'd collect from the next best source. You figured wrong, Thomas said, shifting slightly to put himself between Coulter and Maggie. The debt was paid in full. I have the papers to prove it. Papers. Coulter spat in the dust. I don't put much stock in papers. I put stock in gold. Say, $500 worth of stock. It was an outrageous sum. More than the ranch cleared in a good year. Maggie saw Thomas's knuckles whiten on the rifle stock, but his voice remained steady. You'll get nothing here but trouble. Best ride on while you still can. The tension stretched taut as fence wire. Scout growled low in his throat from the porch. Sensing the danger, one of Coulter's men, a nervous-looking youth, shifted in his saddle, making his horse dance sideways. Seems to me, Coulter said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. A man who's already lost one family might be more careful with the second. Accidents happen out here. Fires start. Stock goes missing. Pretty wife might find herself alone on a long ride to town. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Maggie felt rage bloom in her chest. Rage at these men who preyed on others' misfortune. At her father for bringing this danger to their door. At the unfairness of it all. But alongside the rage was fear. Cold and practical. They were outnumbered, isolated, vulnerable. 1 week. Coulter continued. We'll be back in 1 week for our money. Have it ready, or things might get unpleasant. He touched his hat in a mockery of politeness. Ma'am. They wheeled their horses and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and dread in their wake. Thomas remained rigid until they were out of sight, then slowly lowered the rifle. His face was stone, but Maggie had learned to read the subtle signs of his emotions, the tightness around his eyes, the set of his shoulders. I'm sorry, she said, the words wholly inadequate. This is my fault. My father's sins are not yours. Thomas interrupted firmly. He turned to face her, and she was surprised to see not anger, but a fierce protectiveness in his eyes. You're my wife now. That makes your troubles mine. $500, Maggie said, the sum staggering. Thomas, we don't have... I know. He ran a hand through his hair. A gesture she'd learned meant he was thinking hard. But we have a week. Come on, we need to prepare. The next days passed in a blur of activity. Thomas rode to town, returning with ammunition and supplies. He sent word to the Andersons and other neighbors, warning them of the threat. Some offered help. Others kept their distance, not wanting to involve themselves in what they saw as Sullivan family trouble. Maggie threw herself into preparations with grim determination. She helped Thomas reinforce the shutters, laid in water in case of siege, practiced her shooting until her hands were steady and her aim true. At night, they took turns keeping watch, one always awake while the other slept fitfully. It was during one of these night watches that the change truly began. Maggie sat by the window, rifle across her lap, fighting exhaustion. Thomas should have been sleeping, but appeared in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. Couldn't sleep, he said, offering her a cup. Figured you could use the company. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the moonlit prairie for any sign of movement. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice low, I wasn't sure, at first, why I agreed to the marriage. Told myself it was practical. I needed help, you needed safety. But watching you these past weeks... He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. You're not what I expected. Maggie Sullivan Hartley. You're stronger than you know. I'm terrified, she admitted. Those men, what they might do... Fear's not weakness, Thomas said. Fear keeps you alert, makes you careful. It's what you do with the fear that matters. He looked at her directly. And you faced it head on, like you faced everything else since you came here. I had a good teacher, Maggie said softly. Something shifted in the air between them. Thomas reached out, hesitantly, and covered her hand with his. His palm was rough from work, warm and steady. If something happens, he began. Nothing will happen, Maggie interrupted fiercely. We won't let it. He squeezed her hand gently. But if it does, I want you to know, I'm glad you're here. These weeks, they've been different, better. Like the house is alive again. Maggie turned her hand palm up, interlacing their fingers. It was the first time they'd held hands since their wedding ceremony. But this time, it was by choice, not obligation. Thomas, she said, then stopped, unsure how to express the complicated feelings that had been growing inside her. Not love. Not yet, but something that might become love given time and nurturing. He seemed to understand. I know, he said simply. Me too. They sat that way until dawn, hands linked, watching over their land together. When the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, they were still there, united in purpose, if not yet in heart. The fourth night, Eric Anderson arrived with troubling news. Coulter and his gang hit the Miller's place, he reported grimly. Burned their hay barn, scattered their cattle. John Miller's talking about pulling up stakes, heading back east. He wants us scared, Thomas said. Wants us to know he means business. It's working, Eric replied. Folk are scared. Can't say I blame them. After Eric left, Maggie found Thomas standing on the porch, staring into the darkness. She joined him, noting the tension in every line of his body. We could leave, she said quietly. Start over somewhere else. No. The word was flat. Final. I've buried too much in this land to abandon it now. Sarah, the children, their graves are here. This is Hartley land, and I'll defend it. Then we defend it together, Maggie said, slipping her arm through his. Partners, remember? He looked down at her, and in the moonlight she saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression. I can't lose another family. Maggie, I can't go through that again. You won't, she promised, though they both knew it was a promise she might not be able to keep. We're stronger than they think, and we have something they don't. What's that? Something worth fighting for, she said simply, as if in response to their defiance. A coyote howled in the distance, its cry taken up by others until the night rang with wild music. It was a sound Maggie had once found frightening, but now recognized as the voice of survival itself. Creatures that endured despite all odds, that carved out existence in a harsh land through cunning and courage. The next morning brought a surprise. Pete Sanchez rode in with 3 of his vaqueros, all armed and ready to fight. Heard you might need some help, the old rancher said. Don't like outsiders coming in, making threats, sets a bad precedent. Throughout the day, others arrived, not many. Some folks were too scared or too practical to get involved, but enough to show that the Hartleys weren't alone. By evening, they had a dozen defenders, men and women who understood that the frontier's unwritten laws demanded standing together against those who would prey on the vulnerable. As the 6th night fell, the night before Coulter's deadline, Maggie stood beside Thomas as he addressed their small force. She wore her pistol openly now, had pinned her hair back severely, dressed in a split skirt that would allow her to move freely if needed. She looked nothing like the frightened girl who had hidden behind a veil just weeks ago. They'll come at dawn, most likely, Thomas said. They'll expect us to be tired, scared, ready to give in. They're wrong on all counts. Maggie felt the truth of his words in her bones. She was tired, yes, and scared too. But she was also angry and determined and filled with a fierce protectiveness for this life she was building. Coulter and his kind had taken enough. They would take no more. As the others dispersed to their positions, Thomas pulled Maggie aside. In the shelter of the barn, away from watching eyes, he did something that surprised them both. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I want you to know you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope." Maggie wrapped her arms around him, feeling the solid strength of him, the steady beat of his heart. "We're going to win," she said, "and when we do, we're going to build something good here, together." He pulled back just enough to look at her face, his hands coming up to frame her cheeks. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and she realized she wanted him to. But voices called from outside, and the moment passed. Still, something had been acknowledged between them, something that would have to wait until after tomorrow's violence to be explored. As the stars wheeled overhead and the small army of neighbors and friends prepared for battle, Maggie Sullivan Hartley cleaned her pistol and checked her ammunition. She had come to this place as payment for a debt, hidden behind a veil of shame. But she would face tomorrow with her head high and her aim true, defending the home she had helped rebuild and the man who had taught her that broken things could be made whole again, that even in the harsh landscape of the frontier, hope could take root and grow. The darkness of the prairie night seemed absolute, broken only by the cold glitter of stars and the occasional red glow of a cigarette from one of the watchers. Maggie crouched behind the water trough near the house, her rifle steady in her hands, every nerve straining for the first sign of Coulter's approach. The waiting was agony. Each cricket's chirp might be a signal. Each breath of wind might carry the sound of approaching horses. Thomas was positioned in the barn loft with Eric Anderson and two of Pete's vaqueros, commanding the best view of the approaches. The others were scattered strategically behind the smokehouse, the chicken coop, anywhere that offered cover and clear firing lines. They had turned the ranch into a small fortress, but Maggie knew their defenses were thin, their numbers too few if Coulter brought his full gang. The first pale hint of dawn was touching the eastern sky when Scout began to growl, low and menacing. Maggie's heart hammered as she saw them, dark shapes moving against the lighter prairie, spreading out in a wide arc. More riders than before. Her mouth went dry as she counted. 10, 12, maybe 15 men. "Steady!" she heard Pete Sanchez whisper to his men. "Let them come. Make every shot count." Coulter rode in the lead, bold as brass, stopping just outside effective rifle range. His voice carried clear in the still morning air. "Hartley, time's up." "You got my money?" Thomas's response rang out from the barn. "The only thing you'll get here is a belly full of lead. Coulter, turn around while you still can." Coulter laughed. An ugly sound. "Figured you'd say that, the hard way it is. Then." He raised his hand, and Maggie tensed, knowing the signal meant the world exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Coulter's men charged, the morning air filled with the sharp crack of rifles, the whine of bullets, the shouts of men and screams of horses. Maggie forced herself to breathe, to aim, to squeeze the trigger smoothly as Thomas had taught her. Her first shot went wide, but her second found its mark, sending one of the attackers tumbling from his saddle. The battle raged with terrifying intensity. Smoke from the guns created a hellish fog, making targets difficult to distinguish. One of Coulter's men made it to the house, and Maggie saw him trying to set fire to the porch. Without thinking, she left her cover, rushing forward. The man turned, raising his pistol, but Maggie was faster. Her shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He fled, clutching his wound. A cry from the barn made her blood freeze. Through the smoke, she saw Thomas grappling with an attacker who had somehow gotten past their defenses. They rolled in the hay, fighting for control of a knife that gleamed wickedly in the dim light. Maggie raised her rifle but couldn't get a clear shot without risking Thomas. Then Emma Anderson appeared like an avenging angel, her shotgun booming. The attacker fell away, and Thomas scrambled to his feet. giving Emma a grateful nod before returning to his position. The tide began to turn. Coulter had expected easy victims, not a determined defense. His men, mostly hired guns with no real stake in the fight, began to waver as their casualties mounted, one by one. They began to pull back, leaving their wounded behind. But Coulter himself seemed possessed by rage. Maggie watched in horror as he spurred his horse directly at the house, pistols blazing in both hands. Bullets splintered the wood around her as she dove for cover. She heard Thomas shout her name, heard the boom of multiple rifles targeting Coulter, but the outlaw seemed to bear a charmed life. Untouched by the storm of lead, he leaped from his horse onto the porch, and suddenly he was there, looming over her, his scarred face twisted with fury. "Should have just paid up, girl," he snarled, raising his pistol. Time seemed to slow. Maggie saw her death in the black eye of the gun barrel. She thought of Thomas, of the life they were just beginning to build, of all the tomorrows that would never come. Her hand moved to her own pistol, knowing she was too slow, too late. The shot was deafening. But it wasn't Coulter's gun that had fired. The outlaw's expression changed from triumph to surprise as a red stain bloomed across his chest. He looked down at it, then back at Maggie, before toppling backward off the porch. Thomas stood behind where Coulter had been, his rifle still smoking. His face was pale, his eyes wide with the fear of how close he'd come to losing her. "It's over!" someone shouted. "They're running!" Indeed, with their leader down, the remaining attackers were in full retreat, spurring their horses desperately across the prairie. Pete's vaqueros gave chase for a short distance, ensuring they kept running, while others began checking the wounded. Maggie sat in the dust, shaking with reaction. Thomas knelt beside her, his hands running over her arms, her face, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt? Maggie, talk to me. Are you hit?" I'm all right," she managed. "You saved me. You saved yourself," he corrected, pulling her into his arms. "You were magnificent, fearless. I was terrified," she admitted, clinging to him. "So was I," he confessed, "when I saw him standing over you." His arms tightened. "I can't lose you, Maggie. I can't." She pulled back to look at his face, seeing raw emotion there, not just fear and relief, but something deeper, stronger. "You won't," she promised. "We survived. We won." The sun was fully up now, revealing the aftermath of the battle. Several of Coulter's men lay dead or wounded, on their side. Jake Miller had taken a bullet in the leg, and one of Pete's vaqueros had a graze across his ribs. But, miraculously, no one was seriously hurt. Sheriff Coleman arrived from Cedar Ridge by noon, drawn by reports of the gunfire. He surveyed the scene with professional interest, taking statements, examining the bodies. Coulter still clung to life, though barely. "Self-defense, clear as day." The sheriff pronounced, "Coulter's been wanted in 3 territories. There's a reward, actually, should more than cover any damages." As the wounded were tended and the dead removed, the neighbors began to filter away, but not before each had clasped Thomas's hand and nodded respectfully to Maggie. She had proven herself, shown that she belonged here, that she would fight for her home and family as fiercely as anyone born to the frontier. By evening, they were alone again, the ranch strangely quiet after the morning's violence, together. They walked through the house and buildings, assessing damage, making lists of repairs needed, but their minds weren't really on the work. Finally, as they stood in the kitchen where Maggie had once served Thomas breakfast as strangers, he spoke. "When I saw Coulter about to shoot you, I realized something." He turned to face her fully. "I've been a fool. Maggie, I've been so afraid of feeling again, of caring again, that I almost let it be too late." "Thomas," she began, but he held up a hand. "Let me say this, please." He took a breath. "You came here as a business arrangement. I kept you at arm's length because I thought that's what we both wanted. But somewhere along the way, things changed. You became everything. The light in this house, The reason to keep going. The partner I never knew I needed. Maggie felt tears prick her eyes. Are you saying? I'm saying I love you, he said simply. Not because I need a wife for the ranch, not because it's convenient or practical. I love you for your courage, your strength, your stubborn refusal to give up even when things seem impossible. I love you for the way you've brought life back to this place, and to me. The tears spilled over now, running down her cheeks. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have for a while now, but I was afraid to hope. Afraid you'd always see me as second best, as a replacement. No, he interrupted firmly. You're not a replacement for anyone. You're Maggie, my Maggie, and I can't imagine my life without you in it. He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing away her tears. These past weeks, fighting beside you, building alongside you, it's shown me what we could have together. Not just survival, but a life, a real life. This time, when he leaned in, there was no interruption. Their lips met in a kiss that was tender and fierce and full of promise. It tasted of gunpowder and dust and hope, of hard-won victory and harder-won trust. When they finally parted, both were breathing unsteadily. No more separate rooms, Thomas said roughly. No more distance. Be my wife in truth. Maggie, let me be your husband. Yes, she said, the single word containing all her joy, all her hope for their future. That night, as Maggie lay in Thomas's arms in the bed they now shared, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. From a shameful transaction to a partnership forged in hardship. From strangers bound by necessity to lovers united by choice. Outside, the prairie wind sang its ancient song, and somewhere in the darkness, coyotes called to their mates. What are you thinking? Thomas asked, his voice drowsy with contentment. About how I came here wearing a veil, hiding my face in shame, she said, and how different everything is now. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. No more veils, no more shame, just us, building something good together. Together, she agreed, snuggling closer to his warmth. In the morning, they would begin repairs, would start the work of truly making the ranch thrive. There would be challenges ahead, there always were in this unforgiving land. But they would face them as they had faced Coulter and his gang, united, determined, and unafraid. The little ranch house that had once echoed with emptiness now held laughter and conversation, hope and dreams. And in the barn, carefully stored but no longer needed, lay a yellowed wedding veil, a reminder of where they had started and how far they had come. The frontier had tested them with its harshness, but it had also given them its greatest gift, the knowledge that love could grow even in the most unlikely ground, that two damaged souls could indeed make each other whole, and that sometimes the best things in life came not from what we planned, but from what we were brave enough to fight for when fate forced our hand. The autumn air carried a crispness that spoke of coming winter as Maggie stood in the doorway of the Cedar Ridge courthouse, Thomas steady beside her. 6 weeks had passed since the shootout with Coulter's gang. 6 weeks of rebuilding and healing and discovering the depths of their love for each other. Now they faced a different kind of battle, one fought with words and law rather than bullets. Patrick Sullivan sat at the defendant's table, looking older and more broken than when Maggie had last seen him. His gambling had caught up with him in Denver, and he'd been arrested for fraud and theft. But that wasn't why they were here. Word had reached them that Patrick had been telling anyone who would listen that his daughter's marriage was invalid, that Thomas had taken advantage of a desperate situation, that Maggie was being held against her will. You don't have to do this, Thomas murmured as they waited for the proceedings to begin. We could leave. Let the lawyers handle it. No, Maggie said firmly. It's time to face this, to put it all behind us properly. She squeezed his hand. Besides, I have something to say. Judge Morrison, a stern man with silver whiskers, called the court to order. The matter at hand was Patrick Sullivan's petition to have his daughter's marriage annulled and to claim damages from Thomas Hartley for coercion and false imprisonment. The prosecutor, hired by Patrick with money he'd somehow scraped together, painted a dramatic picture. A young woman sold like chattel to pay gambling debts. A grieving widower taking advantage of a family's desperation. A marriage conducted under duress, with the bride so ashamed she hid her face throughout the ceremony. Maggie watched her father as the lies poured forth. He couldn't meet her eyes, focusing instead on his hands folded in his lap. She felt not anger, but a deep sadness for the man who had once carried her on his shoulders, who had told her stories of brave princesses and far-off kingdoms. That man had been lost long ago to whiskey and cards, and the eternal promise of the next big win. When it came time for the defense, Thomas's lawyer, paid for with part of the reward money from Coulter's capture, systematically demolished the prosecution's case. He presented the marriage certificate, properly signed and witnessed. Testimonies from the Andersons and other neighbors about the genuine partnership they'd observed. The sheriff's report from the attack, showing how Maggie had fought alongside her husband to defend their home. Then Maggie was called to testify. She rose, smoothing her dress, a new one, blue as the Wyoming sky, that Thomas had insisted on buying her for the court appearance. As she took the stand, she saw the townspeople who had gathered to watch, some who had whispered behind their hands at her wedding, others who had stood with them against Coulter. Mrs. Hartley. The judge began, not unkindly. The court needs to hear, in your own words, about the circumstances of your marriage. Were you forced? Are you being held against your will? Maggie looked directly at her father for the first time. I was not forced, she said, her voice clear and strong. I made a choice. Yes, it began as an arrangement to settle debts that weren't mine to pay. But what grew from that beginning? She turned to look at Thomas, drawing strength from the love in his eyes. What grew was real and true and worth fighting for. And what of the claims that you were so ashamed you hid your face at the wedding? The prosecutor interjected. I was ashamed, Maggie admitted, causing a stir in the courtroom. But not of marrying Thomas. I was ashamed of the circumstances, of the whispers, of feeling like I was worth nothing more than a pile of gambling debts. Her voice grew stronger. But my husband showed me I was wrong. He treated me with respect and kindness. He taught me to shoot, to ride, to read Shakespeare by firelight. He stood beside me when violent men came to our door, and I stood beside him. We built something together, not just a ranch, but a home, a partnership, a marriage in every true sense of the word. Pretty words, her father's lawyer said dismissively. But the fact remains that the marriage began as a transaction. Many marriages begin as arrangements. Maggie interrupted, earning a sharp look from the judge but continuing anyway. What matters is what they become, and ours became a love match. Sir, I would choose Thomas Hartley again tomorrow and every day after. Not because I have to, but because I want to, because he is the best man I know. And I am proud to be his wife. The courtroom was silent. Even the judge seemed affected by her passionate declaration. Thomas's eyes were suspiciously bright, and Emma Anderson was openly dabbing at her cheeks with a handkerchief. Papa, Maggie said, addressing her father directly, I forgive you for the debts, for the drinking, for putting me in an impossible position. But I won't let you take away the best thing that ever happened to me because you can't face what you did. You gave me to Thomas to save your own skin. Yes, but in doing so, you gave me a chance at real happiness. Please don't try to destroy that now. Patrick Sullivan finally looked up at his daughter. What he saw there, the strength, the conviction, the love for another man, seemed to break something in him. His shoulders sagged, and he whispered something to his lawyer, who looked frustrated but stood to address the judge. Your Honor, my client wishes to withdraw his petition. The judge frowned. This is highly irregular, Mr. Sullivan. Do you understand what you're doing? Patrick stood slowly, like an old man, though he wasn't yet 50. I do. Your Honor, I was wrong. About everything. My daughter is right. I have no claim here, legal or moral. He looked at Maggie one last time. Be happy, girl. It's more than I deserve, but be happy. He turned and walked out of the courtroom, and Maggie knew she would never see him again. Part of her mourned for the father she'd lost to vice and weakness, but a larger part felt only relief. The last tie to her old life of shame and obligation was severed. Judge Morrison dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning it could never be brought again. As Maggie and Thomas left the courthouse, they were surrounded by well-wishers. The very people who had gossiped about their marriage now seemed eager to embrace them as a true couple. That was quite a speech. Mrs. Hartley, Mrs. Morrison, the judge's wife, said with approval. "It's not often we see such genuine emotion in that courtroom." "I only spoke the truth," Maggie replied, her arm linked with Thomas's. As they climbed into their wagon for the journey home, Thomas pulled her close. "You didn't have to say all that to defend me so fiercely." "Yes, I did," Maggie said simply. "You've spent months showing me through actions that you love me. It was time I showed the world the same thing." The ride home was peaceful, the autumn landscape painting the prairie in shades of gold and rust. They talked of practical things, the need to bring the cattle closer before winter, plans to expand the vegetable garden come spring, the letter from town suggesting Maggie might indeed start a small school for local children. Mrs. Hartley, the schoolmarm. Thomas mused. "It suits you. Mrs. Hartley, the rancher's wife, suits me better," she replied, earning a kiss that made her forget about the cooling air. That evening, as they sat before their fire, in their home, Maggie brought out something she'd been saving. It was the old wedding veil, carefully folded. "I thought we should burn it," she said. "Let go of the last reminder of how we started." Thomas took the yellowed fabric, examining it thoughtfully. "Or we could save it," he suggested. "Not as a reminder of shame, but of journey. Someday, when we have daughters, we can tell them how their mother was brave enough to face an uncertain future, how she took a chance on a broken man and made him whole again." "Daughters?" Maggie asked, a smile playing on her lips. "Sons, too," Thomas added, pulling her onto his lap. "A whole house full of children to chase away the silence." "I'd like that," Maggie said, resting her head against his shoulder. "Though perhaps we should start with one and see how we manage." He chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Fair enough." His hand came up to stroke her hair. "Maggie, what you said in court was all true," she finished. "Every word. I never thought I'd have this again," he admitted. "Love, laughter, hope for the future. After Sarah and the children died, I thought my heart was buried with them. But you brought me back to life. We saved each other," Maggie corrected. "That's what partners do." Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The coyotes would sing soon, and the wind would whisper through the grass, and all the sounds of the prairie night would surround their little home. But inside was warmth and light and love, precious things in a hard land. Maggie thought of the frightened girl who had hidden behind a veil, too ashamed to show her face. That girl was gone now, transformed by hardship and courage and love into a woman who faced the world with clear eyes and an open heart. The veil remained, but not as a shield, rather as a reminder that even the worst beginnings could lead to the happiest endings, if one had the courage to remove the covering and let oneself be seen. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked, noticing her contemplative mood. "Just that I'm glad," she said. "Glad for everything that brought me here, even the hard parts, because it all led to this moment, to us." He kissed her then, deep and sweet, and she knew that whatever tomorrow brought, winter storms or summer droughts, lean years or times of plenty, they would face it together. Not as a desperate girl and a grieving widower brought together by circumstance, but as husband and wife, partners, lovers, and best friends. The veil went back in the trunk, not burned but preserved, a testament to transformation. And in the years that followed, when their daughters and sons asked about it, Maggie would tell them the story of how love could bloom in the most unlikely ground, how courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to face it, and how sometimes the very thing we try to hide from becomes the source of our greatest strength. But all that was still to come. For now, there was just the two of them in their little house on the prairie, no longer hiding behind veils or walls. but open to each other and to all the possibilities that their love had made real. Spring arrived early that year, painting the Wyoming prairie in vibrant greens and scattered wildflowers. 5 years had passed since Maggie Sullivan had arrived at the Hartley Ranch hidden behind a yellowed veil, and the transformation was remarkable, not just in the land, but in the lives built upon it. The ranch house had grown, with a new addition housing the 3 bedrooms needed for their expanding family. 4-year-old Sarah Rose, named for the past but representing the future, chased chickens in the yard while 2-year-old James Thomas toddled after her, his chubby legs working hard to keep up. Inside, Maggie hummed as she prepared breakfast, occasionally glancing out the window to check on the children, her hand resting on the gentle swell that promised a 3rd child by autumn. Thomas entered from the barn, Scout padding faithfully at his heels despite the dog's advancing years. He paused in the doorway, as he often did, to simply watch his family, a habit born from years of loneliness, as if he still couldn't quite believe his good fortune. "Breakfast is ready," Maggie called, smiling at him over her shoulder. "Better call the children before Sarah Rose decides to adopt one of those chickens as a house pet." "Too late," Thomas replied with a wry smile. "She's already named the red one Princess Feathers and insists it needs to sleep in her room." Their easy laughter filled the kitchen, a sound that would have seemed impossible in those first awkward weeks of their marriage. As the family gathered around the expanded table, handcrafted by Thomas during Maggie's first pregnancy, the morning sun streamed through windows now softened by curtains Maggie had sewn, casting warm light on a scene of domestic contentment. "Mama, can we go to town today?" Sarah Rose asked, her father's gray eyes bright with excitement. "Mrs. Anderson said there might be a letter from Aunt Charlotte." Charlotte was Maggie's cousin from back east, one of the few family connections she'd maintained. They corresponded regularly, and Charlotte often sent small gifts for the children: hair ribbons, picture books, sometimes candy that rarely survived the first day. "We'll see," Maggie said, helping James with his porridge. "Your father has work in the south pasture, and I have bread to bake for the school gathering tomorrow." The school had been Maggie's project, started small in their own barn, but now housed in a proper building raised by the community. 15 children attended regularly, learning their letters and sums alongside lessons about respect, hard work, and kindness. Maggie took pride in knowing that no child in their valley would grow up unable to read or write, regardless of their family's circumstances. After breakfast, as Thomas prepared for his day's work, he found Maggie in their bedroom, standing before the old trunk at the foot of their bed. She had opened it and was holding the yellowed wedding veil, lost in thought. "Remembering?" he asked softly, coming to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist. "Thinking how different everything is," she replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "That frightened girl who hid behind this veil. Sometimes I can barely remember being her." "I'm glad you kept it," Thomas said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "It reminds me how brave you were, even when you were scared, especially when you were scared." "We both were brave," Maggie corrected, turning in his arms. "Brave enough to take a chance on each other." A crash from the kitchen interrupted the moment, followed by Sarah Rose's voice declaring, "It's not broken very much, Mama." They shared a rueful smile and went to investigate the latest catastrophe. The day unfolded with the familiar rhythm of ranch life. While Thomas worked with the cattle, Maggie tended the expansive vegetable garden, now properly fenced and thriving, with the children helping in their enthusiastic way. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors, a wagon approaching from the east, unfamiliar and travel-worn. Maggie shaded her eyes, watching as the wagon drew closer. A young couple, by the looks of it, with a small child. Something about the woman's posture, shoulders curved inward, head down despite the bright day stirred recognition in Maggie's heart. "Can we help you?" she called as they pulled up to the house. The man, hardly more than a boy really, removed his hat nervously. "We're looking for the Hartley place, ma'am. Heard in town that you might, that is, we're in some trouble and, "What kind of trouble?" Thomas asked, having noticed the visitors and ridden in from the pasture. The young woman finally looked up, and Maggie saw her own past reflected in those haunted eyes. "My husband, Daniel, he owes money to some men in Cheyenne. Gambling debts. They said they'd take me as payment if we couldn't pay. We ran, but we can't run forever. And we heard about how you folks stood up to Jake Coulter. That was 5 years ago," Thomas said carefully. "Things are different now. Please." The woman, barely 18 by Maggie's estimation, whispered, "We have nowhere else to go. I'll work. I'll do anything. Just please." Maggie and Thomas exchanged a long look, entire conversations passing silently between them. They saw their own story reflected in this desperate couple, saw the fear and shame and desperate hope. "What's your name?" Maggie asked gently. "Rose," the girl replied. "Rose McKenna. This is Daniel, and our boy is called Daniel Jr., DJ." "Well, Rose, Daniel," Thomas said. Decision made. "Why don't you pull your wagon around to the barn? We'll get you settled, and then we'll talk about what's to be done." The relief on the young couple's faces was painful to see. As they moved their wagon, Sarah Rose tugged on Maggie's skirt. "Are they going to live with us, Mama?" "Maybe for a little while, sweetheart. Sometimes people need help, and we help them. That's what good neighbors do. Like when all the people came to help us fight the bad men?" "Exactly like that," Maggie said, smoothing her daughter's hair. That evening, with the McKennas settled in the small cabin Thomas and the neighbors had built for seasonal workers, the Hartley family gathered on their porch to watch the sunset. The spring air was sweet with the scent of blooming wildflowers, and the horizon stretched endlessly, full of promise. "Do you think they'll stay?" Thomas asked, bouncing James on his knee. "I think they'll find their courage," Maggie replied. "Just like we did. Maybe they'll take over the Jameson place. It's been empty since the old man died last winter." "You're matchmaking with property now?" Thomas teased. "I'm community building," Maggie corrected primly. "There's a difference." Scout barked suddenly, alerting them to another rider approaching. This one they recognized. Sheriff Coleman, older now but still sharp-eyed. He reined up at the porch, tipping his hat. "Evening, folks. Heard you took in the McKenna family." "Word travels fast," Thomas observed. "It does. Thought you should know. Those men from Cheyenne came through town asking questions. I sent them on their way, but they might come looking." "Let them come," Thomas said calmly. "We've dealt with their kind before." The sheriff smiled. "That you have. Just wanted you to know the whole town's talking about how you folks took them in. Emma Anderson is already organizing a welcoming committee for the young family. Says if the Hartleys vouch for them, they're good people." After the sheriff left, Maggie marveled at how much had changed. Once, she and Thomas had been the outcasts, the subjects of gossip and speculation. Now they were pillars of the community, their judgment trusted, their home a haven for those in need. "Full circle," she murmured. "What's that?" Thomas asked. "Just thinking about circles, how we started, where we are now, how that scared girl hiding behind a veil became—" She gestured at their life, their children, their home, became the strongest woman in Wyoming. Thomas finished. "The woman who tamed the untamable Thomas Hartley." "You were never untamable," Maggie protested. "Just wounded. We both were." "Mama, tell us the story," Sarah Rose demanded. "About the veil and the bad men and how you and Papa fell in love. It had become a family tradition. This story, told with increasing drama and decreasing accuracy as Sarah Rose's appetite for adventure grew. But the heart of it remained true. Two broken people who found wholeness in each other, who built something beautiful from the ashes of their pain. As Maggie began the familiar tale, with Thomas adding his own embellishments and corrections, she felt a deep contentment settle in her bones. The old veil remained in the trunk, a tangible reminder of where they'd started, but it no longer held power over her, no longer represented shame or fear. Instead, it had become a symbol of transformation, of the courage to show one's true face to the world. of the incredible journey from a transaction to a true partnership. Their children would grow up knowing that love wasn't always instant or easy, but that it was worth fighting for, worth building day by day, choice by choice. The stars began to appear in the vast Wyoming sky, and coyotes called in the distance, no longer a sound of loneliness, but of wild freedom. In the little cabin, the McKennas were probably holding each other, wondering if they'd found safety at last. Maggie remembered that feeling, that desperate hope mixed with fear. Tomorrow, she would visit Rose, would share her own story more fully. She would tell her about the veil and the shame and the slow building of trust and love. She would promise that it got better, that courage could be found even in the most frightening circumstances, that sometimes what seemed like an ending was really a beginning in disguise. But tonight, surrounded by her family on the porch Thomas had built with his own hands, Maggie Sullivan Hartley was simply grateful. Grateful for the winding path that had brought her here, for the man who'd seen past her veil to the woman beneath, for the children who carried both their parents' strength and stubbornness, for the community that had embraced them, and for the future that stretched ahead like the prairie, vast and challenging but full of infinite possibility. And they lived happily ever after, Sarah Rose prompted, knowing how the story ended but wanting to hear it anyway. They lived, Maggie corrected gently, with happiness and sorrow, good times and hard times, but always together. And that, my darling, is the best ending of all. As the family headed inside for the night, Thomas caught Maggie's hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that still made her heart flutter after all these years. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. "Not one," she answered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The veil remained in the trunk, but its story lived on, not as a tale of shame overcome, but as proof that love could transform the most unlikely beginnings into the happiest of endings. That courage was choosing to remove our veils and show our true selves to those worthy of seeing, and that sometimes the very thing we try to hide becomes the foundation of our greatest joy. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love, courage, and transformation in the American frontier. I hope Maggie and Thomas's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Are you by a cozy fireplace, on your daily commute, or perhaps under your own vast sky? Please subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales of romance and redemption in the Old West. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and connections make our campfire circle complete. Happy trails, partners.